On April 26, 2021, shortly after I became the Attorney General, I announced that the Justice Department had opened a civil investigation into the Louisville Jefferson County Metro Government and the Louisville Metro Police Department. Our investigation sought to determine whether those entities engage in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution or federal law.
That was Attorney General Merrick Garland, and the United States Justice Department has found that the Louisville police violated civil rights. These findings stem from an investigation that followed the murder of Breonna Taylor on March 13th, 2020. And let's take a look at some of what the Justice Department had to say in a press release. Following a comprehensive investigation, the Justice Department announced today that the Louisville Metro Police Department and the Louisville/Jefferson County Metro government engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that violates the United States Constitution and federal law. The department also announced that it has entered into an agreement in principle with Louisville Metro and LMPD, which have committed to resolving the department's findings through a court-enforced consent decree with an independent monitor rather than contested litigation coming directly from the Justice Department. And details of the findings are as follows: the use of excessive force, including unjustified neck restraints and the unreasonable use of police dogs and tasers, conducts searches based on invalid warrants, unlawfully executes search warrants without knocking and announcing, unlawfully stops, searches, detains, and arrests people during street enforcement activities, including traffic and pedestrian stops. Part 2 to this is the following: unlawfully discriminates against Black people in its enforcement activities. Underline it, bold and scored. Y'all know what? Violates the rights of people engaged in protected free speech, critical of policing. In other words, don't say nothing about them. Along with Louisville Metro, discriminates against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to them in crisis. This was the announcement today. And ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, I did have a chance to watch this press conference, and it was really good to see the Department of Justice stepping in. They also emphasized during the press conference that Louisville had started to make some reforms right after the death or the murder of Breonna Taylor without the Justice Department coming in there. Good on them. Wish they had made those changes before, then maybe Breonna Taylor would be alive. However, glad to see that they started working on themselves before the feds came in there. I was quite disturbed, Jackson, with some of the stuff that they found. They found that law enforcement officers in that area would refer to Black people as monkeys, would call them boy, and also refer to them as animals. And I had myself, the historian in me was starting to think, are we in the 1800s here? Calling Black people monkeys, is something that white Americans, put Jackson back up, please, partaked in on a regular basis, calling us monkeys, calling grown men boy, calling grown women girls, and calling us animals. It really was quite chilling and disappointing.
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, just based off different policies that have passed, we've gone back in time. I mean, Roe being something that was in place for over 5 decades, and then just the cultural battles that we're having in terms of like, what is a woman? What is a woman's place in society? What is a man's place in society as the world continues to change? But I think one of the most obvious things that stand out when we look at these types of stories, and even though it's definitely good that there's some form of accountability here, is that being a police officer is, that's the profession that you get to follow protocol the least. Oftentimes, we only talk about people who end up dead on the other side of these types of things. But even with speeding tickets, different types of traffic violations, officers will often use different types of machinery that haven't been properly tested. Or, they every year, every 2 years, they have to get tested to make sure that they're showing the right numbers. And they'll use machines that haven't been tested. If you don't have a lawyer, then you never would have figured that situation out. People who get thrown in jail, kept in jail, if you get pulled over with a couple of grams of marijuana. Oklahoma just failed to pass their legalization of marijuana. So things like that still happen in states like Oklahoma, where police officers basically just kind of get to do what they want and expect to get away with it. So any form of accountability that we can have is extremely important.
And that word, accountability, was something that came up a lot during this press conference, that in order to keep a community safe and also keep law enforcement officers safe, which the vast majority of them do their jobs. I mean, I have law enforcement personnel in my family. I certainly have friends who have law enforcement personnel in their families. We know that it is a dangerous job, no doubt about it. Anything can happen at a moment's notice. But what is necessary is the community has to trust law enforcement. That means that they truly have to really protect and serve. Most law enforcement agencies have that on the side of their car, protect and serve. But unfortunately, historically, especially within the Black community, it has not been an effort to protect and serve. It has been to lord over, right? To control and not protect and serve. So that accountability, Jackson, came up a lot. And also some of the remedies. I mean, the DOJ recommended about 36 remedial measures, and part of those remedial measures was clear police training. We know that training comes up a lot. Training can solve some of this, but it can't solve all of this. And the bottom line is, what type of people are you hiring to be in these law enforcement agencies? Because ultimately what it comes down to is what is in their hearts, and you can't train that. I'm all for the training, don't get me wrong, but there's some things that training cannot deal with. All right, so we got to do that. Another thing that they brought up that I thought was very important was the equipment. And Jackson, that's what you talked about. They found that a lot of the equipment that the law enforcement officers had to deal with was out of date, or as you noted, had not been tested. And then the other thing was a clear chain of command, that the people in the chain of command have to have very high expectations, and that there must be repercussions and consequences, my words, for people not following those procedures and those protocols immediately. That has to happen. And then the last thing that they mentioned was that there was no psychological testing for these officers over time. And I think that is vitally important in any type of police reform, that you have to psychologically test these officers on a regular basis, because the job is so intense and it can weigh on you. You got to make sure that people are still in the right state of mind when they're doing work like this. So, and then some of the things that the city and that they started to put forward even before the DOJ was no more no-knock warrants. A certain 911 calls will have co-responder models to it. Like, do we need a social worker? Do we need somebody that's specially trained to deal with people who may have be having a mental crisis as well? Violence prevention services, internal auditors. So I'm really happy about some of the things. Lastly, they said they're gonna stay on them. And that's gonna be most important, to make sure that they are following through with these activities. We will continue to watch this as we watch all types of cases like this all over the country. It's past time for reform. The entire legal system needs to be reimagined from top to bottom, and that's from the streets where we have our law enforcement officers all the way to the courtroom. There is something wrong with the system in whole. But good on the Department of Justice and good on the mayor for taking responsibility.